It's been a long week of racing at the Tour of Britain, but we've no doubt saved the hardest day of racing for the final road code race analysis video, culminating in a finish circuit that takes in Caerphilly Mountain 2 times. This all means that for the first time this week, I'm talking about my specialist subject, climbing. And this being road code means we've got access to the rider's data, so we can compare the watts per kilo in the final climb and see how the race was won. As the riders rolled out of Margam Park, we may have expected to see more aggressive start from the bigger teams, but looking at the profile, with the first 70 kilometres on rolling roads, no major difficulties. I wasn't surprised to see the World Tour teams really keeping their powder dry for that hilly mid-section of the course when there was 2 Category 1 climbs and a number of other difficulties packed into the space of 50 kilometres across the Welsh mountains. So again, the breakaway was one of familiar faces, riders that we've seen throughout the week, with the other World Tour teams content to see Jumbo-Visma burn yet more matches chasing the 6 riders up front. Today's route, with its hilly midsection, was ideally suited to an ambush tactic. With a Jumbo-Visma team built around the sprint lead-out train, Van Aert could only really count upon Steven Kruijswijk as a teammate who could be considered a climber, and so I'm sure the other teams, especially INEOS Grenadiers and Movistar, would have highlighted the fact that they could easily isolate Van Aert on such a hilly course, but that they would also need to use their advantage in numbers and attack early, as Van Aert seems to be a guy that if he gets a sniff of the finish line, he can hold on. However, any plan to attack on the first uncategorised difficulty of the day wasn't possible, as due to a non-race related incident, there was a road closure in place and the race had to be diverted around the bulk climb and off course towards the first KOM of the day. As a rider, these situations are always a little bit difficult to deal with because your rhythm gets broken and it's sometimes difficult to stay concentrated and focused. And once the race restarted, we could see the intent in the group as Movistar really laid down the power on the first KOM of the day, showing that perhaps they would have attacked earlier if it wasn't for the diversion. But it was the INEOS Grenadiers team who really made the first big move, collectively launching Carlos Rodriguez with around about 50 kilometres to go on the second Cat 1 climb of the day. He was joined by Stevie Williams, who yesterday I was praising for his tactics, but this time I see it as actually a mistake, as he was one of the strongest climbers in the race, only 3 seconds off Van Aert in the GC. It meant that other teams were going to be interested to chase behind. I really think we could have seen Stevie Williams do something special on the Caerphilly Mountain circuit if he had waited in the peloton, but he was part of the INEOS Grenadiers wearing down process of the Jumbo-Visma team, and especially Van Aert, as they piled on the pressure. Van Aert being completely isolated on top of the climb, having to wait for his teammates to rejoin the peloton, or what remained of it, and by the time they did, Carlos Rodriguez and Stevie Williams had over a minute and a half. But again, not wanting to miss out, Jumbo-Visma could count on the support of Movistar in the chase behind, narrowing the gap on the fast roads towards Caerphilly Mountain for the first time. With this little interchange between Stevie Williams and Carlos Rodriguez, we get a little bit of insight into why Carlos Rodriguez had attacked. Now, ordinarily, he shouldn't really be working with Stevie Williams, who is a threat to their other riders on GC, but the fact he works together with Stevie says to me that the aim was to put as much pressure on the other teams as possible, setting the race up for an attack on the GC by Magnus Sheffield. At this point, there was a certain urgency in the group behind, Van Aert recognising that he had to get as close as possible to the duo in front in order to have a chance of saving his leader's jersey. Task made easier when Stevie Williams was dropped by Carlos Rodriguez towards the top of the climb, but this urgency still meant that Van Aert rode the first time up the climb 2 seconds faster than the second time. Arguably, one of the strongest guys in the peloton on the flat, a guy who finished second in Paris-Roubaix, Nils Pollitt, managed to hang in there with Van Aert on the first time up the climb, averaging a monumental 560 watts the first time up. That's around about 7 watts per kilo. But my old teammate Nils couldn't quite do the same effort again the second time up, only, in inverted commas, managing 540 watts, which is around about 6.7 watts per kilo, which is still huge after what was a very difficult day of racing. For a 4-minute 30 climb, and it wasn't like he was exhausted at the top, he still pushed on to the finish. But it was our lone leader and eventual stage winner who really showed his class as a climber. The second time up, only losing 7 seconds to a rampaging Van Aert, managing to maintain an average power of 430 watts over the final climb for 4 minutes 23. Which, taken in isolation, is not that huge for a world-class climber like Carlos Rodriguez, but when you consider he had already been in the breakaway for 45 kilometres at this point, the final 1 hour and 20 minutes of his race averaging 330 watts, it's a real display of strength. I was slightly disappointed that we didn't see more direct attacks on the leader of the race, but of course that's always much easier said than done, especially when you're facing a rider of the calibre of Van Aert. Plus, with the GC so finely poised, the 3 guys who finished with Van Aert were guaranteed a top 4 finish on GC. I did find myself expecting Magnus Sheffield to put in an attack and potentially try to bridge across to Carlos Rodriguez. I did think that was the plan, but that would also have been a risk, as he could have closed the gap and the team would have lost the stage victory. In the end, it was not only those 3 seconds that Van Aert managed to take from the peloton on stage 5, but also the crash of Carlos Rodriguez on stage 7 that really decided this race. And that rounds out the 2023 Tour of Britain with a very worthy winner. It was a week of finely poised racing, and I hope that you've enjoyed the race analysis videos with me, Dan Martin, and the Road Code team. Be sure to keep following Road Code for all your behind the scenes action. But for now, how about we take one last look at that amazing attack from Wout van Aert on stage 5 that sealed his victory in the 2023 Tour of Britain. That huge acceleration out of the first left-hand turn, followed by a second sprint up to speed, and then maintaining around about 900 watts seated. That was the most mind-blowing thing for me. A lot of riders struggle to do 900 watts sprinting out the saddle, but he stayed low and aero, averaging 860 watts for a minute to seal the stage victory and gain those 3 seconds that proved valuable in the fight for the general classification. Congrats to the Jumbo-Visma team, and see you next time.
And he's at it again, the exceptional Wout van Aert, close to the finish line. No one saw that coming, and Van Aert's attack totally unanswerable. The sprint is unfolding behind him. He looks round, he checks, he's got to keep riding, got to try and take a time gap if he can, but Van Aert does it again for Jumbo-Visma. It's Ben Turner is sprinting behind. Van Aert's going to hold on now. Wout van Aert lights up the Tour of Britain. Only he